Here we are with another round of audiophile bullshit, and this comes to you courtesy of WiredWorld and their Starlight CAT8 Ethernet cable. So they have a Q&A, and I want to pick through this a little bit. So their first question is how can an upgrade cable improve the streaming fidelity of Ethernet? Well, it can't. As long as you have a quality cable that's fast and spec, you're going to get your data. So they're going to make a couple arguments here, and it's interesting to see how they build this. First off, they build it with two truths. The first truth is that TCP/IP is a reliable transport, and it is. There's error correction, there's detection, there's windowing, there's reliability. And then they go on to talk about UDP, which UDP is really, you throw a dart and you just hope that it hits the target. UDP is actually pretty robust and reliable in and of itself, but it doesn't have any error correction. I do believe it does some error detection. UDP does not mean that the application provider, whether it be Tidal or Rune or Netflix or Amazon Streaming or whoever it is, it doesn't mean that upstream that they didn't do their own buffering and error correction and detection where if they see a problem, they're going to have that data resent. So with that being said, those are two truths. Now let's get to the third part. So they've got in your mind, well, that's true and this is true. So the third thing that they're going to insert here, somebody out there that's not going to be critically thinking about this or doesn't understand how Ethernet works is going to be thinking the third part's true. And they're talking about the last mile or the last 4 feet. They say streamed music and video signals have only one chance to get through, so a cable with better waveform fidelity and lower noise will reduce errors, thereby preserving more of the original information. I've never seen 4 foot of cable fix 2,000 miles of sin. It's that simple. If you have a compliant cable specification-wise, they're all going to do a good job. And all that data that they're transmitting is going to be successfully extracted. It's going to go through a multiple copy process to make it off the cable, through the buffer on the network adapter, through some RAM set aside by the CPU for that bus, through the CPU, probably back to some RAM buffer set aside by the application, then more buffer for the USB bus, and then finally a buffer on the DAC where a final clock is actually applied to all that data that doesn't have any timing applied to it, no clock. So that answers that. So no, it's not really going to fix the 2,000 miles ahead of it. So our next question is how can a short WiredWorld Ethernet cable improve fidelity? So they already know the first question that's going to be asked after you've read their first Q&A. And the last link of Ethernet connection isn't any more critical, so they're saying it's far more critical than the in-wall cable. No, it's not any more or any less critical than any other leg, because Ethernet is a system in its totality and it's connected. And if you have any problem at any connection point, you've got a problem, unless there's some redundancy built in. All right, so that's out of the way. So we get into triboelectric noise. Triboelectric noise is a real phenomena. You move a cable around, there's multiple conductors, they're in insulation, they rub up against each other, they generate a charge, and that charge shows up as noise. Think of an instrument cable or mic cable as it gets moved across the stage. Anybody that's been to an amplified concert sees them walk all over the place. They're using an industry grade cable. The audio sounds great, the vocals sound awesome, the guitar, the bass, the keyboard, whatever. It's all good. You're not hearing anything. That's because it's all been engineered away. Triboelectric noise is of particular concern in the medical industry where you may be hooked up to an EKG machine. You have to make sure that that noise isn't affecting the readings. And there's a spec for that. And the spec is the AAMI EC53 spec. And that spec goes on to say that you can't have more than 50 millivolt peak-to-peak of triboelectric noise on the cable. And they have a test for it. You take a 7-foot span, you spread it across, you take a 7-foot cable, you stretch it across a 5-foot clear span, you take the weight of 1 foot of said cable, multiply times 40. You apply that weight to the middle of the cable, and then where you have a measurement apparatus hooked up, you release the weight, the cable takes the weight, and you will get a reading. As long as that reading for medical applications is below 50 millivolt peak to peak, you are golden. So that's out the window, because in your home environment, you're not going to be moving cables around like that. And if you're really concerned, truly paranoid, just use some of those plastic cable staples to make sure that the cable doesn't move. The only way that this would ever work is if you hung your speaker from the network cable. That could indeed maybe do something. I jest. Let's go down to our next question. What other problems are they solving here? Well, they're talking about routing the cable. They're saying that round cables are stiff and require special tools to assemble. When I hand terminate cables, which I try not to do, I'd rather just get the machined ones. I use a $5 box cutter, and I use probably a $50 mechanical crimp, and I've ran certified 5E and 6 networks using just those tools. So they're not the only one also offering flat cable, and let me show you this. You can get 50 foot of flat Ethernet CAT6 cable for 13 bucks off Amazon. And here are those handy dandy little triboelectric reducing, we'll call them grunions. So that way we can charge, like, you know, $1.99 per each one of those. So you make a lot of money if you just reword it. Our last question is actually a continuance of question number 2, and they're talking about the performance is difficult to achieve with category 8. And yes, the higher category that you go with your data cabling, the tighter the tolerances get, because you're pushing higher frequency. You know, most homes, I'm going to say most homes, I'm going to say 99.9% of the homes are going to get more than just fine with unshielded twisted pair 5E cable. And that cable is good for gigabit networking, which means that you can push about 105 megs a second over that. Put this in the contrast. If you want to do 2496 over your network, you only need half a megabyte a second out of that 105. If you want to do 24.192, you only need about 1,000, less than 1 meg, so less than 1 out of the 105 megabytes. So, you know, gigabit applications just has a ton more bandwidth and headroom than even, you know, high def audio requires. And, you know, for FLAC, or, you know, just straight up 1644.1, it's just trivial. So you just don't need this level of cable. You know, category 6 and category 8 are really data center centric cables. Category 8, the spec for that is 1600 megahertz signaling rate, and that's why you need such a tight tolerance at the end where you're going into the connector, because crosstalk certainly becomes an issue at that point. You just don't need it for the home. It's overkill. Here they bring up interpair skew, and that is where you got some timing variance, and the skew is a difference between signal propagation and when it exits the cable. There's you know, there's allowable skew. You can have so much skew before it becomes a problem. Again, as long as the cable is within that definition of skew or crosstalk or any of these other measurements, you're going to be fine. It's just not a problem. WiredWorld needs to show you that this is a problem with measurements. They need to show you this as a transfer function of the cable as it relates to the speaker output. And they're not going to be able to. And I actually do welcome WiredWorld to sit down with me. We will set up a switch in the link aggregate group. We will set up a client machine with teamed adapters, and we will be able to start playback of music and swap out cables in real time while that music's playing. And anyone at WiredWorld is perfectly willing to sit down and tell me which is their cable and which is some $10 cable that I picked up. And I'll tell you what, I'll even make it more difficult. They can pick any of their current sized, typical patch cable, which, I would think 5 meters is like max. And, I'll double the length. If they want to go 5 meters on their cable, I'll go 10 meters on something I pull off a spool and terminate right in front of them. And they're still not going to hear a difference. So this whole thing is bullshit. Save your money. Buy a good quality cable. Triplite, Blue Jeans cable. They all will sell you a certified cable that is going to hit spec. And that's really all you need. So hope this has been helpful.